Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the Hindu newspaper analysis where we bring for you today's international edition of the Hindu newspaper, analyze the important articles relevant for your prelims as well as the mains examination. While carrying out the discussion, we shall be extracting the main crux, and wherever required, we shall also be shedding light on the basic concepts associated with those particular articles. Along with that, we also take a look at the practice questions and try to understand how to go for a mains type answer writing for those questions. If you have liked this initiative of ours, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Now, before taking a look at the topics that we are going to cover today, an announcement for all of you. Now, there is a special Diwali offer for everyone. Now here, basically, we have brought about an unbeatable price in which we are providing an offering of the best quality of lectures along with the test series, along with the kind of guidance that is almost unparalleled, and there will be a flat 55% off and up to 9 months free extension will also be provided. So hurry and do avail this particular opportunity. Now we take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. So today in total we are going to have a discussion for 7 different topics, 4 of them slightly in greater detail associated with the mains exam, and then 3 of them associated with the prelims. So we start first of all with India-China to take up coordinated patrolling. That is something which has appeared in the front section, front page, and this is something which has been a build-up, and this is a news story which will follow up as well. So this is going to be relevant for your GS paper too. We are going to extract some important portions from this. Where is Demchok? Where is Depsang Plains? That also can be relevant for your prelims examination. Sharpen the anti-defection law and strengthen democracy. This is an article in the editorial page. This talks about the lacunae, the flaws in the anti-defection law. So we will utilize this in order to understand that what that anti-defection law is all about. Without going into too much of an extensive detail, a brief background about defection. What do we understand by that? What is the provision of the anti-defection law? Where are the areas where there is a scope of improvement? That is something we are going to talk about. A Nobel in hand, but where AJR's model falls short. Now we have discussed about the Nobel in economics. Now here, this is an article in the editorial section which talks about the fact that the entire model of economic inequality which has been propagated, for which the Nobel has been awarded, there are certain significant flaws. So what are the flaws, and is there any substantial evidence to indicate those flaws? So that is a very interesting article which is very relevant in terms of the Indian experience. This is for your GS paper 3. And this has been written by the member on official duty for the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Committee, making it all the more interesting. Now, the 4th article is about fair trade. This is about the Conference of Parties number 29, which is going to be held in Baku. Now, before that, India is sorting out its own carbon market mechanism. So with the help of this, we shall be taking a look at what the concept of carbon market is, right? And why it is important for India to develop a mature carbon market mechanism. So relevant again for your GS paper 3. And 3 of the articles, we shall be taking a look at it briefly. One is that ISRO and DBT have signed basically an agreement to conduct experiments in space, and that is going to be significantly helpful in terms of establishment of our own space station going ahead into the future. India's coking coal imports surged to a 6-year high, and government doubles the loan limit under the Mudra Yojana. So these are the articles that we are going to cover today, starting with the first article, that is India-China to take up coordinated patrolling. Now, here, India and China, they both have declared that disengagement, and in principle, disengagement has been achieved. That is, the troops have started to pull back. and all the various different military installations which were there at the forward areas in the mighty height of the Himalayas, they have been dismantled and the troops are slowly and steadily moving back. You see, this disengagement that India and China are talking about, now in certain parts this was initiated long time back. To just give you a very brief background in 2 to 3 minutes, basically when that Galwan clash happened in 2020, at that point of time the Indian forces were at a back foot. And there were significant amount of Chinese incursions in the Pangong Tso finger areas, and that is where the Chinese were basically becoming dominant. If I can show it to you with the help of a map. So see, this is where you have the Galwan Valley. This is where the clashes took place. Now, why the clashes took place? That is owing to India's development of Daulat Beg Oldie. For those of you who are not aware, this is an active airfield, India's northernmost airfield, where India has gained the ability by development of a lot of infrastructure to land heavy aircrafts, to move troops into this area very quickly. Now, this is almost around 8 to 10 kilometers from the very vital Karakoram Pass, which connects the region of Xinjiang all the way to the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So this is a vital route of the Chinese motorway, which was developed in the 60s. So activation of Daulat Beg Oldie created and ruffled some feathers in China, and that is where the aggression began. Now, but when you had the Galwan Valley clash, you also had simultaneous incursions in the region of the northern bank and the southern bank of Pangong Tso. And there were issues in the Gogra Hot Springs region, in the Depsang Plains, and all the way in the region of Demchok as well. Demchok is in this area. Now, that was followed by Indian Army's action across the Kailash ranges, where they gained superiority. And that was in the month of August itself, the last few days of August. Now, immediately after the Indian forces gained certain level of superiority, the Chinese agreed to disengage and move back. So disengagement started happening across the banks of Pangong Tso. That was achieved across Gogra Hot Springs over the next many months. That was achieved. But there was a problem in the region of the Depsang Plains and in the region of Demchok. The region of Demchok. Now, you see, Depsang Plains, they are a flattish terrain in the high altitude, which talks about where you can have the tank battle carried forward. This is where India has been developing at an ultra fast pace the light battle tanks to be deployed in these areas. Depsang, in the entire region across the border, you will find that it is only Depsang Plains where you can have a dominance in terms of the tank battle. So that is why this was important. So these were the problems and the contentious areas which were left. That is the Depsang Plains and the region of Demchok. Now this is where disengagement has been achieved eventually, and that is considered to be the final breakthrough. But then there are many questions which have also been raised in the past couple of days, ever since the announcement was made by Minister Jaishankar. After that, there have been many issues and questions which have been raised by former diplomats, experts of the defense matters, etc. Satellite imagery does confirm that the Chinese are also moving back from their post. But then, when this conflict was at its top, there were many areas which were claimed mutually by both of them. In some areas, the Chinese had come in certain areas, the Indians had gone to that side, and those were declared as buffer zones. So in this entire process of disengagement, there is no certainty about what happens to the buffer zones. Right. So as you can see, there is another article again in page 3. So buffer zones may not come under the patrolling agreement. So what India and China, they have agreed now is a kind of a coordinated patrol. What do we mean by that? That basically means, let's suppose this is an area of contention. So there will be a coordinated patrol not more than twice a month. So the patrolling will be carried out around 2 times a month. So when the Indians would go out for patrolling, they would inform the Chinese counterparts and they would desist from patrolling at that point of time. When the Chinese would begin to patrol, the Indians, they would not be patrolling at that point of time. So this is a coordinated patrol in order to avoid any kind of clash which could take over or which could spiral into a larger conflict. This is to basically keep the temperatures down in a kind of a virtual term when it comes to the border clashes and the border disputes. Now, while it can achieve a long-term peace, and in this, Indian Army basically, and the sources in the Indian Army as per the article have indicated that we are going to return to the condition prior to 2020, right? So what was the condition prior to 2020? But then India has also agreed that in the Yangtze region in Arunachal Pradesh, they would not be blocking the Chinese patrol anymore, which they were doing earlier. So that has raised suspicions and questions. What happens to those buffer zones? Who claims those areas? While Indian government maintains that the Chinese have not carried out any incursion in any part of the Indian territory, which we all do believe, but then the Chinese also say that they are not going to lose any territory. So what is the need of the hour at this point of time is a complete transparency about this disengagement talks and also highlighting which areas where we have our extent. Now, there is a problem in that also. We will talk about it very briefly. But the issues, lack of transparency. Has India lost its control over the buffer zones? Has China finally gained some area in the Depsang Plains? Now, those of you who are aware about the brief history of the region, you would be aware that over the past few decades, China has been slicing away the region of Depsang Plains. It was in 2020 when India finally put a stop to it, that no more salami slicing policy will be followed there. But then, is there a reality that the Indian patrols have a limited extent as compared to pre-2020? Can Indian patrols go to some of the very contentious areas like PP15, the patrol point 15, patrol point 13, patrol point 17? So there are various different patrol points which are very, very contentious. So that is what is required to be understood. But why is it that the governments, even in the past and even today, they do not come out exactly with the contours of the disengagement agreement? Because one has to understand, whenever there is a kind of a deal, a disengagement, there is a compromise, both sides win some and lose some. Oftentimes, when it is provided to an entire public or the larger public perception is thrown open to it, at that point of time, there can be a conflagration of the public opinion that we have lost that or we have lost that particular area. And that is not always conducive for the peace talks. But then what minimal should be done is taking the parliament into the confidence. The elected representatives of the people whom we have chosen, they should be taken into confidence and there should be a kind of a transparency. And that is required to be understood even in terms of the foreign policy scholars about how India's entire approach towards the line of actual control has been changing. Okay? So that is about the first article of the day. Now, after this, we come to the second article. That is Sharpen the Anti-Defection Law and Strengthen Democracy. Before that, I have a question from Bahadur. For UPSC, how many months current affairs necessary? 12 to 18 months, yes. 12 to 18 months is required. Now, this is about sharpening the anti-defection law and strengthening democracy. Now, when we say defection, most of you would have known about the fact that the political reality of the country as of now is what? You will find that there is oftentimes the elections which happen. We are an electoral democracy after all. So we basically have the case where, let's suppose, individuals in a particular political party, once they get elected, after that, they oftentimes jump ship. They move from one region to another, right? One political party to another. Now, this is something which has been carried on for a very long period of time in our political system. This was at its peak in the 1960s. That is when the Chauhan Committee, led by the very prolific leader Y.B. Chauhan, he pointed out, and the Chauhan Committee pointed out about the number of these defections happening in the 1960s. But basically, before that, what do we understand by defection? While the term defection, it indicates revolt, dissent, and rebellion by a person or a party, generally, it refers to leaving an association to join another. That is defection. Now, when we talk about the history of defections in India, most of us, we think about the fact that defection started in the 1960s. And most of us, we think about the legislator in Haryana and that individual, Gayalal, who ended up shifting many political parties within the same day. And that is where the terminology Aya Ram, Gaya Ram became a norm, and it became quite colloquially famous. But then, when we talk about the history of defections, it was something which was present even in pre-independent India. You basically had Shyam Nehru in earlier times, who basically left the Congress party to join the British side. Then you also had Mr. Ibrahim Hafiz in the 1937. So initially you had Shyam Nehru, and this is pre-independence, right? Left Congress to join British side, right? Then you had Ibrahim Hafiz, right? Now, he was elected in 1937 on a Muslim League ticket. But then after getting elected, he jumped ship to Congress. So Muslim League to Congress. Now, when India became independent, at that point of time, immediately after a decade and a half, this number of defections, they started to increase. That is when, in order to understand the entire problem, and this problem basically was further exponentially raised when you had the very famous case of Mr. Gayalal, who, the legislator from Haryana, within the same day, he managed to jump parties multiple times, right? And that is when you had the Chauhan Committee. So Chauhan Committee was set up in 1969. And this Chauhan Committee, which was set up in 1969, it talked about the fact that, look, ever since India gained independence, till that point of time, till 1969, from the time of independence till 1969, that is in a span of almost 20 years, 22 years, there had been more than around 580 defections. But of all those 580 defections, more than 450 of those defections happened in the year between 1967 and 68. So that told you that the rise of the fact that the political ideology taking a backseat and the rise of political aspirations, individual aspirations, was something which was very dangerous. And this Chauhan report, the Chauhan Committee report, also indicated to the fact that there is an increased number of independent legislators. The independent legislators basically joining a political party in lieu of certain kind of gains. The committee indicated that there were almost 200 cases of independent legislators who were elected and then they joined a political party, right? And interestingly, out of around 200 or plus legislators who had joined a political party, you basically had almost 115 out of them who were rewarded with ministerial berths. They were made a minister once they joined a political party. So that in itself told you that it is the political aspiration of the individuals that is gaining precedence. And that was the requirement, that was the necessity why we needed to have an anti-defection law. Now, there were multiple different iterations whereby you had the aspect that should we go ahead, or what kind of law should be made in order to prevent the people from jumping ships, in order to prevent the independents who basically claim an independent ideology at the time of elections and joining and merging with a political party. What should be the modus operandi or method of operation? It was finally in 1985 when you had the 10th schedule, and with the amendment to the constitution, you had the anti-defection law which was established. So what was this anti-defection law? So basically, the need for the anti-defection law, first of all, before that, so there was a requirement of political stability in the country, right? The requirement of political stability. Then restore trust in electoral democracy. Okay, because after all, the electorate has entrusted an individual that he or she will basically represent their opinion, and he or she is representing the ideology that the electorate relates to. And tomorrow there will be a dilution of the ideology when that individual merges with someone just in order to gain the ministerial posts. So that is why the trust in electoral democracy could be eroded. So to restore that faith, and also to ensure that there is an accountability for the people you elect. That is what is the sign of a healthy democracy after all, isn't it? So based upon all these, you had the 10th schedule and the anti-defection law which came into place. Now what was this anti-defection law? So basically it talked about the conditions under which an individual could be disqualified. Right? Now, if a member of a house belonging to a political party has voluntarily given up his membership of such a political party, or votes or abstains from voting in such house contrary to the directions of the political party. And here by directions of the political party, we mean what? The whip issued by the political party, right? The whip issued by the political party. If that whip is defied, right? In both these cases, the member will be disqualified. But you see, before moving ahead to the rest of the provisions, there is a kind of a lacunae in this, a drawback. And it is only apt for us to understand the drawbacks at this stage. As we move ahead to the other provisions, we will understand the issue. So basically, when you talk about voluntarily given up his membership of such a political party, so this does not clearly define that when an individual indulges in anti-political or anti-party activities, that is not included in this. Let's suppose as a member, I am not giving up my membership of the party, but at the same time being within the party, I am carrying out some anti-party activities. Now, if the political party basically expels me, then what? So that is where the anti-defection law is silent. You have the court judgments which have taken a kind of a precedence in that, but the law in itself has got a big loophole here. Then the second portion, that the direction of the political party, that is a whip issued by the political party, if that is defied. Now in that case, there should be some amount of transparency with regards to the whip issued, isn't it? Otherwise, there's a lot of scope of political maneuvering. So that is why the whip issued, and this is what the article also argues, that make it transparent. What is the whip issued by the political party? Let it be transparent. And then it will be very clear, like day, that this individual has defied the whip. And the anti-defection law norms will apply to that individual. However, in this particular provision, there is a kind of a escape route provided to those members as well. Let's suppose they have defied the political whip or the whip of the political party. But let's suppose the political party in the next 15 days condones the action of the legislator. So if the member has taken prior permission from the political party for any of such activities or is condoned by the party within 15 days from such voting or abstention, the member in that case shall not be disqualified. That is, if within 15 days of such activity, the political party is convinced that, okay, or issues a statement that fine, this is a member who has taken the permission, who had taken a permission for such activity, or fine, we are fine with their activity, then that member won't be disqualified. Okay. Now, if an independent candidate joins the political party after election, he or she can be disqualified. If a nominated member of a house joins any political party after the expiry of 6 months from the dates when he becomes a member of the legislature. So these are some of the provisions due to which there can be disqualification. Okay. Now, there will be, now this is as per Rule 2. Rule 2 of the law. Then after that you have Rule 3 and 4, which talk about that there will be no disqualification of members if they represent a faction of the original political party which has arisen as a result of the split in the party. If the party in itself has been split, like what we saw in the case of what happened with NCP, Shiv Sena, and previously also, that if the political party is split, then you won't have the case of disqualification. A defection by at least 1/3 members of such political party was considered as a split which was not actionable. Why was this provision? For example, let's suppose the political party, the heads of the political party, they have taken a particular stance on any issue, or they have basically decided to go ahead with a kind of a coalition politics, etc. Now, if majority of the members or large number of members of that political party, they don't agree to that decision, they cannot leave the political party, they will be disqualified. Right? They cannot act against the political party, they will be disqualified. So what is the option they have? So that is where the provision was provided that if 1/3 of the members, they decide to move away and there is a split, fair enough, you won't be disqualified. But 1/3, particularly in smaller parties, it was very easy to achieve. Right? Where you don't have that many elected representatives, 1/3 of that is very easy to achieve. So that is why this is a provision which was deleted after the 91st Amendment in 2003. And this was made to 2/3 of the political party split. Now, these are the provisions. Now, ever since the anti-defection law has come into place, there has been a kind of a control in terms of the aspect of how many people are jumping the ships, but it is still a reality that people do jump the ships. Now, mostly it is immediately prior to the elections, as we saw during the recently conducted Haryana elections, that there were a lot of political switchover which happened immediately prior to the electoral process. Now, the Rule 6 also talks about the fact that the chairperson or the speaker, that is the final authority in terms of deciding the cases of defection. So there is too much power there. But then, fair enough, the leader, that is the chairperson, basically is the conductor of the house. But at the same time, you have to understand that they have to decide on these defection cases, on these anti-defection cases, and also on the aspect whether a member can be disqualified or not. But what oftentimes happens is that this case is dragged by the chairman for a very long period of time without any end to it. And that is when the political tenure gets over and the member continues to enjoy all the privileges and the perks. So basically people go scot-free. So that is where there are certain shortcomings within this particular law which needs to be addressed. One is expulsions. That is, what if an individual who is an elected representative, right? Let's suppose there is an elected representative in a political party and the party has expelled that individual. So once the party has expelled that individual due to certain other activities, certain nefarious activities, etc., now the law does not talk about the fact whether the person will be immediately disqualified or not, because he has not voluntarily given up the party membership. He has not acted against the party's whip. Whip is issued when? When there is a time to cast vote, when there is a time for the party's opinion on the parliament floor, on the floor of the parliament, etc. So this is where, about the expulsions from the political party itself, that is where the law goes slightly silent. Then, wide power to the speaker. Now, this is where there is no time limit which is provided for the speaker to decide upon the cases. There should be a time limit. That, let's suppose 4 weeks, let's suppose 6 weeks. You decide upon that and you take the decision. It can have the judicial review on it, right? But then, unless and until you decide it quickly, this matter keeps on getting postponed and pushed ahead without much fruition. And that in itself vitiates the purpose of the anti-defection law. Then, lack of transparency in terms of the whips which are issued to the by the political parties to the individual legislators. So these are some of the shortcomings. What is the way forward ahead? So first of all, before talking about any changes, major changes in the law, about expulsions, about voluntarily giving up the membership, etc., before all of that, the existing process which is established by this law, that is basically about the chairperson deciding, the aspect of the whips being made more transparent, that is something which should be sorted out, right? And there should be certain exemplary cases set also. So while you have the case where the Supreme Court has taken a very firm stance in the case of this political defections, but we have to understand that in order to restore the long-term faith in electoral democracy, in order to uphold that electoral democracy, something that we value and we prize so much, we need this anti-defection law to be strong. That does not mean curbing the ideological freedom of the individual legislators, but it definitely requires them to be more accountable to the electorate who has sent them and provided them with the power. So in this article, what is it that we have discussed? What is defection? The concept of defection, the history of defections in India, the findings of the Chavan Committee. Then after that, we discussed about the provisions of the anti-defection law, the shortcomings in that anti-defection law, and what is the way forward. Okay, I hope this is understood. Right? Now, let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the importance of reforming the anti-defection law in order to uphold a healthy electoral democracy. So how do you introduce the answer? What do you write in the introduction? You talk about the fact that what is defection, right? You start with that itself, the concept of defection. That is joining or leaving a particular political party or a particular ideology and joining some else. So that is, or joining the other side. That is the aspect or the principle of defection, right? So what is the principle involved? Right? See, if it would have been a 15-marker answer, then you should also provide the findings of the Chavan Committee. And in the 60s, what happened? That within 67 and 68, out of the total more than 580 plus defections which had happened since independence up till 69, almost 450 plus defections happened in 1 year. And also the fact that you had more than 100 of the legislators who basically ended up jumping, the independent legislators who jumped ship to a political party, and more than 200 of them did that, and around 115 of them were made ministers. So there is that lure of personal gain. So that is something that you can talk about in the body. Very briefly, a couple of sentences about the need of the anti-defection law. Talk about the 52nd Amendment, 1985, 10th Schedule, very briefly, the provisions. Now, why is there a need for reform? So this is what you have to highlight in the body. Need for reform. To restore trust, to ensure transparency, to maintain accountability, to provide teeth to the provisions of the defection law, right? What are the reforms needed? Okay, so reforms needed. That is what you talk about. And then in the conclusion, what do you write? That it is important in order to restore faith and in order to uphold the electoral democracy and maintain it for the coming years. Okay? I hope this is something which is clear. Right? And there is no doubt. Ganesh, space, and there is a department of science, the science and tech, but overall space and the space sector reports directly to the PMO in many of the cases. Right? So depends upon which area are you talking about in that case. Okay? Now, there is science and tech and space sector is different, Ganesh. So you have to keep in mind that. A Nobel in hand, but where AJR's model falls short. Here by AJR, what do we mean? And this is a very interesting article in today's newspaper. Because for the past week, we have been celebrating about the fact that the Nobel for in economics has been provided to the individuals who have talked about the aspect or the importance of institutions in terms of economic progress. Very briefly, I'll talk about that as well, just for a quick revision. But AJR represents Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson, the three individuals who have been given Nobel Prize. Now, a quick recap about that for those of us who have forgotten this. Basically, these individuals had been given the Nobel Prize owing to the fact that they had talked about the fact that the institutions can be of two types. Institutions can be either inclusive, where they provide democratic rights. They basically respect the right to property for the individuals. There is more freedom for the individuals. So there are inclusive institutions and they are extractive institutions. So the extractive, basically where the institutions are modeled around the fact that you extract as much amount of resource from the population. So inclusive institutions lead to growth and development. Extractive institutions lead to financial poverty. And they had taken a city on the US-Mexican border as an indication of the fact. And that talked about that whichever region has got an inclusive institutions, whichever region has got more democratic and respect to private property, where the private property won't be tampered with, where nobody can take away private property that you have some sense of security, there you will always find greater number of economic progress and people making that economic progress. Now, that was the predicament, or that was the entire postulation for which they have been given the Nobel Prize. Now, they have written the books also, the best-selling books also. But interestingly, this article offers a contrarian view. This article provides you with 5 different points by which you can puncture the entire ideal process provided by these individuals. Now, it is a kind of a contrarian view. It is not exactly going to be absolutely correct, but it is a different point of view of thinking, which is always required as a civil services candidate. You need to be able to understand what is the positive, what is the negative, and both sides of the argument should be understood. So while most of us, we have agreed to the fact that yes, inclusive institutions are required for a healthy growth. But what are the lacunae in this entire model? First of all, the article argues that when you are talking about the institutions and the development of institutions, that is a very Eurocentric model. What do we mean in terms of the Eurocentric model? So basically, assumes that good institutions serve as universal path of development. Right? It is a very European model of development. And this basically talks about replication of Europe's development across the rest of the world. Now that in itself is flawed. Every society is different, every region is different, every growth process is completely different. And this has been substantiated by the reports or the works by Yuan Ang. Now Yuan Ang basically has highlighted in the report or in the works that it is not always the case that the institutions are inherently good or bad. Certain institutions, they evolve along the way, right? And that talks about the case of, okay, I have a question that is anti-defection law help to reduce chances of tyranny? Absolutely yes. You can, Mumtaz, mention the Shiv Sena example as well. Okay. Shazia, your question is not clear. What is the request, my dear friend? Okay. Right. Transparency of whip, Roger, is basically when you when whatever whip is issued by the political party, that is something which is made transparent and public to everyone. Okay. Right. Now coming back to it. So basically, Yuan Ang's work has talked about the fact, with the help of the example of China, that it is not inherently the character of the institution that the institution will be very good or the institution will be very bad. There is a kind of what is referred to as a directed improvisation. What is the directed improvisation? That institutions also learn along the way. The institutions also are the aspect of iterative development, iterative changes. Unlike the Eurocentric model, that iterative changes oftentimes shows the adaptability of the institution, the ability of the institution in order to adapt to the changing circumstances. And it is not always driven by the central governance and the government's ideology always. It might work true for small European countries where you can have a government directive being implemented because they are composed of certain districts. Small number of districts compose the entire country in Europe. But in larger areas like India, China, in these areas, you have the federal structure, you have at the city level a different kind of governance model, different requirement in one area, very completely different requirement in another area. So the institutions can vary. And it has been indicated, for example, the creation of special economic zones in China, in the eastern coast of China. Now, initially that was not a central policy by the CPC of China, right? So basically, this was an adaptive approach by a local institution in a particular place, which led to an economic boom in China. So the entire aspect that the institution needs to be inclusive in order to provide the economic growth, that is punctured by the Chinese model. Because if you think about the Chinese institutions, are they inclusive? Absolutely not. Are they extractive? Yes. No property rights to many individuals. You do have the overhanging rule of the central government, and that is where you basically have a kind of what other people call as authoritative, dictatorial society, etc. But has it managed to achieve economic progress and growth? Absolutely yes. So that punctures the entire Eurocentric model. Then misreading of the Western development, how the development in the West has happened. Now, today, all these three individuals and the Western scholars, they think about the fact that the Western development has been rooted in the most novel ideals that the society has ever seen, development of institutions, etc. But for those of us who have some idea about history, which most of you have, when you take a look at the economic progress during the Industrial Revolution, after all, it was the Industrial Revolution which made Britain what Britain became. Now, during that period of time, was there healthy institutional process in place? No. There was exploitation of the colonies, capitalism, cronyism, inequality to the worst level. Workers were exploited and they reached that economic progress. Natural resources were depraved. And was there a kind of voting rights provided to the individuals? No. But still the Western countries progressed. Today, it is like whitewashing the entire process of Western development. Today, it is like telling the world that, see, we had those inclusive ideals for centuries, that is why we developed. No, that is not the case. So that is another lacune in this process, right? It was the drain of wealth, perfect, from the colonies, which basically have led to this. Then, it is a too simplistic view in terms of if the institutions are like this, a region will develop. If the institutions are extractive, the region will not develop. What about the entire concept of having a welfare state? When we have a welfare state, there is a state intervention. And state intervention oftentimes is modeled to be changing with time, and it is reactive many of the times. Depending upon the condition of the time, it is reactive. So that entire welfare state model, that is put out of the window here. Right? This entire theory that they have developed, this revolves around the two poles. One is Western democratic ideals or authoritarianism. So development will happen in democratic ideal, and in authoritarianism, it will not happen. But there's a large area, gray area in between where growth and development is still happening. Take the case of India. In our case, are the institutions perfect? No. But do we gain some amount of development? Yes. Why? The government's policies, be it at the state level or at the central level. Then, oversimplification of the historical role of institutions. When you provide the role of institutions in being accountable for development in a region. Now, institutions, especially in the past times, they were not only about property, wealth, democratic ideals. Democratic ideals you can put out of the window. 100 years back, 150 years back, nowhere were the democratic ideals present. But then, the institution served as judicial body. The institution served as financial institutions, financial mechanism. There was a wide role of the institutions. It was not only about inclusive and extractive. That is very simplistic, right? And then, when they talk about colonialism, the individuals say, and that is how simplistic their model is, that when the colonizing powers like Britain, for example, they wanted to live in an area. They liked an area. They developed institutions which can be healthy, which is inclusive. There they gave example of US. And when the colonizers, like the British power, they did not like a region, they did not want to live in a region, they extracted all the raw materials. And here you can have examples like India and Africa. But were their roles only limited to that? Were the role of the colonizing powers limited to that? No. In majority of the developing world today, in majority of the population of the world today, the very aspect of inequality was seeded by the colonial experience. The very aspect of division in the society, communalism, casteism, for example, in our case, right? All these schisms were significantly exploited by the colonial times, and we are facing the brunt of it. Even after being independent, we are facing those divides in the society which were not only highlighted, exposed, exploited and extracted to their level best by the Britishers. So that is where the colonial experience is something that the Western world seems to never be able to understand. and how the colonial experience or the overhang can have an impact for many centuries, many decades, even after independence. It is not only about having an independent institution. What will the institution do if the society in itself is fractured and divided? So these are the lacunae and the major lacunae in the economic model, or the model that they have provided to prove the economic progress in a particular region, right? So that is the case of this particular article. I hope you have understood that. Critically analyze the role of institutions in ensuring long-term development of a region. Critically analyze. So here you have to talk about the benefits also and the disadvantages also. So when you talk about the role of institutions, basically, let's suppose you talk about that in the introduction, you talk about that any particular society, any particular economy, the growth lies in the inclusive institutions, the respect to the rule of law, all that you talk about. After that, while you mention the benefits of that individuals gain more freedom, they are able to utilize the human capital to a much better level, there's a better level of educational, socio-economic progress is much more, the society becomes accepting, then you provide the challenges. However, the institutions themselves, they are not the end. You need to have government interventions, you need to have basically a kind of an adaptive approach in order to ensure that welfareism development reaches the grassroots, and only after that the holistic development can be reached. Okay? So that is something you can write. Right. Educational institutions must be inclusive. Absolutely yes. Okay. Now coming to the fourth article, fair trade. This is about the conference of parties to be held in the region in Baku, Azerbaijan. So basically, this is relevant for your GS3. Now, this conference of parties to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is going to be held next month in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, the main agenda of the conference of party is going to be about climate finances. And by the way, interestingly, today's newspaper also features an article that the framework convention or the convention on climate change, they don't have the finances to conduct ministerial delegations. Because the countries like US, who promise the world that we will take care of the climate and you should also do your correct part, they have not paid a meager sum of around 7 to 8 million euros, which is required for the logistical purposes. Having said that, the main agenda is the aspect of climate finances. But there is an expectation of very little progress owing to the fact that the US elections are on. And because US cannot commit anything financially, other developed countries will also not commit anything financially. Even if they commit, that will never come to fruition. But India is also using this opportunity in order to spruce up its carbon market. Now, when we talk about carbon market, so there basically under Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, it talks about the revitalization and the importance of having a carbon market. Now, India, as per its Panchamrit goals, which were made in Conference of Party number 26 in Glasgow. That was in December 2021. Now, it was here that India made the Panchamrit Declaration. And that included reducing the emissions, reducing the carbon intensity of the GDP to less than 45% by the year 2030, to have a significant increase, 50% of renewable energy by 2030, increased renewable capacity by almost 500 gigawatts by 2030, net zero emissions to be attained by 2070. So India had made a host of promises. Now, as per those promises, India basically has to reduce the amount of carbon emission carried out by the industries as well. So that is where India needs to develop the carbon market. So what is this carbon trading and carbon market? Very briefly, we talk about that. So when we talk about the concept of a market, concept of carbon market, what is that? So for example, consider that you have various different sectors in industry. You have the iron and steel sector. If the iron and steel sector, if India wants to reduce its overall emissions, iron and steel, fertilizer, chemicals, these are some cement, aluminium, these are some of the industries which have to be given a target that you cannot emit more than this, right? Only then will you have an overall reduction in emission. Otherwise, how will you reduce the emission? So let's suppose the iron and steel sector has been given a target. You cannot emit more than this. But in order to lower the emissions, what is required? Modern tech, newer facilities. That takes around 3 to 4 years. So before that, let's suppose the iron and steel sector emits more than what the target is. This is the target. They have emitted this much more. Meanwhile, let's suppose some other industry or some individuals have carried out afforestation, right? Under the green credit program of the government. They have carried out afforestation. Now they have also got some carbon credits, right? So there can be carbon credits that they have. They can sell that in the market, gain some money. Or let's suppose there is another target for the chemical industry, and one particular industry has emitted only this much lower than the target. So for the amount of emissions reduced, this company A will be given some amount of credits, carbon credits. Now the steel sector has exceeded its target. So the steel sector, in order to compensate for that exceeding the target, will have to buy the credits. That much amount of credits have to be bought, and there is money to be paid in return. Or it can buy credits from, let's suppose, someone who has carried out afforestation under the green credit scheme of the government, and they will pay them in return. So this is the establishment of a carbon market. Now India is going to set up the individual targets of sectors like steel next year, whereby they have to meet certain emission standards by 2025. And that gives a lot of scope for industries in India to move and pivot into renewables. And you have to understand that India is a very significantly fertile carbon market, in the sense that India is also planning an expansion in the renewable energy. So the more renewables a particular company is able to install, they will be having more number of credits. And industries like steel, cement, fertilizer, aluminium, they will be requiring to buy those credits for a long period of time. So in the next few years, or up till the next decade and a half, the carbon market is going to be well established and is very much required. However, there are certain complex formulations and calculations which are required. For example, calculating how much amount of emissions have been carried out. What is the exact amount of emission? So that is something where some complexity is involved, but then in the long run, that will be ironed out only after, again, as is the case of the institutions, iterative adaptations. You try, and you learn from the mistakes, and you improve that. Okay? Now, then we move on to certain articles relevant for your prelims. ISRO and Department of Biotechnology, they sign agreement to conduct biotechnology experiments in space station. So, basically, certain experiments, like when you talk about that weightlessness, in space you experience weightlessness. So in that case, what is the loss of the muscle mass? Now these are important because India aspires to establish the Bharatiya Antariksh Station, Indian Space Station. Before that, India plans to go for the Gaganyaan mission. So for all these experiments are required, right? What kind of algae might be suitable in order to preserve the nutrients for a longer period of time in space for individuals who will be in space for a longer period of time. How basically algae can also be used for jet fuel. The impact of radiation on the health. So all these will be carried out, and this is a sign of the maturing of our space sector, how our space sector is maturing with times and meeting the requirements of the future. Okay? Now, India's coking coal imports surged to a 6-year high. India is the largest importer of the coking coal, right? Coking coal imports have surged to a 6-year high. So, this coking coal traditionally had been imported in India. Coking coal means coal required for industrial purposes like smelting, metallurgy, etc., in the blast furnaces, etc. Now, India's traditional source of coking coal import was from Australia. But cheaper coking coal from Russia has basically replaced that. And why does India import coking coal? For industrial processes. Now, why doesn't India use its own coal? Because the grade of coal, bituminous coal that we have in our country, that has got a very high sulfur content, very high amount of ash generated, and slightly lower calorific value. Due to all of these, there is a kind of an inefficiency present. Now, steel makers in our country, we are the second largest manufacturers of crude steel in the world. So, for steel makers, coking coal is required. And import surge also means that our steel production is increasing. That is good for the coming quarters and for the economic development, because if the steel sector improves, the infrastructure construction activity picks up, the overall economic output also picks up. Okay? Now, the last article. Government doubles loan limit under Mudra Yojana up to 20 lakh. So basically, under the Mudra Yojana, the government provides loans to budding entrepreneurs and the individuals who want to start their own business under 3 different subcategories. You have Shishu, Kishore and Tarun. Under the category of Shishu, you have the loans which are sanctioned up till rupees 50,000. Under the category of Kishore, the loans sanctioned from up till 50,000 to 5 lakhs, and under Tarun, sanctioned between 5 lakhs up to 10 lakhs. So this Tarun, that particular scheme here, for those entrepreneurs who have managed to pay the previous loan in a timely manner, for them that limit will be raised down to 20 lakhs to further encourage the job creators. So for your prelims, you have to be mindful of what are the 3 provisions. Okay? So that is where our discussion comes to an end. I hope that this session has added some amount of information and knowledge to your existing information set. If you have liked the video and if you have liked the content, please don't forget to provide that in the comment section and in the like, click and the subscribe button. Having said that, today we will also bring out a video about stubble burning. When I say a video about stubble burning, why the stubble burning happens, because that has been in news, that is very important for you to understand. And that should be away from your political considerations and political alignment. That what is that stubble burning? What are the legislative issues involved? What is the Punjab Groundwater Act? Why is it that the stubble burning is not carried out in other areas? What is the impact on soil? Purely for the purpose of civil services examination, so that you are much informed at the end of it. Okay, so do watch out for that space and take a quiz on the Telegram section for the MCQ questions. Till we meet again, do take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.